Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to a conversation about literacy across the curriculum. I'm so pleased today to be joined by some of my good friends and colleagues. Christy Thomas and I are hosting Julie Valancourt and Susan Noble, who are learning specialists with Rocky Schools. And they spend a lot of time working with teachers across the school district building literacy. Thanks for joining us today, guys. We really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming.
So we want to kind of start by with the essential question. When we're talking about literacy, it's obviously something that's a big buzzword. Alberta Ed tells us we're going to have literacy infused in everything we do. It'll be the foundation of education. I think most parents expect literacy to be a key component. But what's that we're really talking about? What's the definition of literacy that you like to work with? Can one of you guys jump in and help us think about what's entailed in literacy?
One of the things I always kind of like to think about when the word literacy comes up is point of access. So are students able to, what is their point of access into whatever the content is that they're hoping to explore? And what happens when those points of access have roadblocks in the way? And how can we help students to continue to access the information that they're after?
So a lot about how we can access information, and you talked about roadblocks. What does that look like? What do you mean by roadblocks?
Well, anything that's preventing students or getting in the way of students accessing information, accessing data, accessing content. So things like gaps in their phonemic awareness, gaps in some of their understanding of just how our language works. Sometimes it's disabilities that have been identified. Help me out, Julie.
No, you're doing good, Susan. And like the way you're talking is accessing the content. So we're mainly talking about reading, not reading and viewing, but I think also when we're talking about what's literacy, is communicating the meaning. So we're also talking about that output, the speaking, the writing. We want to make sure that students have the tools that they are able to share their messages in a literate way so people can understand the message that they're trying to share.
So when you talk about it that way, it moves beyond just text, but into oral language, multimedia communication, even numerals and other symbols beyond just letters and words. So we're not just talking about reading and writing, although that's a key component. It's a broader definition, and a lot about sense making and communicating messages, what I'm hearing you say. I really like at the end of this quote, it talks about the world around us and this sort of role that literacy plays in having us really interact in our world. And in that sense, sometimes I find it hard to even know where literacy ever stops, right? Like maybe that sets us up well for thinking about this conversation today about literacy across the curriculum. I might ask you to tell a little story here, Julie, because it always sticks with me when I think about the role of assessment and the role of giving formative feedback to learners. When you visited our class before, you spoke about being on the phone with your husband and looking under the hood of your car, and the kind of feedback that was helpful and what wasn't helpful. And really, to me, that sticks. I'll maybe get you to tell that story and then relate it to how it sits with what one of the things we know about teaching and learning being connected with feedback. Can you tell that story again?
Yes. Well, just to frame it, like when we're talking about literacy and this literacy assessment and the feedback we give, the idea is that we want the reason why we're assessing, and I think that graphic that Susan actually created really represent well this idea that we're assessing not just to give a grade in the report cards, but it's for us to understand our learners, to be able to design the instruction that will meet their needs. And then we want that formative assessment to be able to track the growth, to see if our instruction is having an impact, and then being agile, where you're going to modify your instruction to make sure that it's having an impact on their instruction, on the the way they're learning. And I'm just thinking back on me when I started teaching. I know at my school I had to do running records, right? Reading evaluation, reading assessment. And I was doing it purely for the grades. I was doing it just to find the reading level. And I still remember teaching and in report cards or students and say, okay, buddy, you did good. You're reading at level 26. And then the parents would say, so how can I support my kids? Well, just get them to read more because hopefully he's going to get to level 27 next, right? But I did not know, like those levels were not helping the parents to support their children or the kids. Like read more, how vague is that, right? Like that's not, I would not know where to start. So the example you were referring, Josh, is making sure that we know, and I'm talking about reading, but this also applies to writing, that the feedback that we're giving our students is specific enough so they will know what next step to take. So the example would be me driving on Deerfoot and having my car breaking down. And the first thing I will do will be to get out of the car, take my cell phone and call my husband and say, Guy, you need to help me. I broke down. I don't know what to do. Guy, good husband, would tell me, well, lift the hood. And I say, yes, Guy, the hood is lifted. What's next? And then Guy will tell me, look harder. You'll see, you'll be able to fix it. Come on, look. Honestly, I can look all day long at what's under the hood. If he's not giving me more specific instruction, I will not know how to fix my car. So I guess the analogy is, as we're giving feedback to our students, we need to make sure that we're giving them clear direction. If my husband would have told me, well, look in the left up corner at that wire, is it plugged in? Him giving me specific things, I would know where to focus my attention. So reflecting back on me at the beginning of my career, when I was telling my students, read more or add more details to your writing, it's so vague. I'm totally sending them searching under the hood, not knowing where to look, what to focus on. And often we're sending those messages to our students and they're not making the improvement. And it's mainly because of the feedback we're giving that's not specific enough.
Thanks so much. We were talking in our course about this kind of metaphor of teacher as designer of learning. And really, to me, so much of that is that human-centered element of responding, understanding need, and then designing instruction, designing our next steps and the learner's next steps towards what we know they need to do, and then welcoming them into that conversation as well, right? And creating a situation where students are able to be themselves assessing what their next steps are. We give them criteria and we give them processes and strategies so that they can start being flexible with which tools they use and which strategies they employ to identify their own next steps and really create this cycle on overdrive because it's occurring all over the classroom.
I like the word you use, Josh, flexible. I think, yes, we need our students to be flexible, but us as teachers, we need to be flexible. For me to tell my students, read more, if I'm not seeing any improvement, or like even if I try a strategy, if I'm asking my kids, if I'm supporting a student with decoding and I said, use your finger to chunk the word. If I've been using that same prompts for 3 months and the student is still not showing improvement, really, who's the slow learner? For 3 months, the kid is telling me that strategy is not making sense for him. And the teacher needs to be flexible and reflect, okay, I've been teaching that students use your finger to chunk the words. If I'm not seeing improvement, I need to be flexible. I need to be agile and change my approach to something else that may connect with the student better, right? Again, it goes back to understand the learner and that involving the student. Is that making sense to you? Is this helping you? Help me. How else can I better, like involving that student in that process, I think is super important.
Also connected. Oh yeah, go
I was
ahead.
just going to jump in and say, I think further to that too is just professional reflection on how did I introduce my student to those strategies? Did they know was I clear? Did they know what I meant? Did I have an opportunity to model the strategies and work alongside them to make sure that transfer happened with accuracy and that they are using those strategies as they were meant to be used?
Absolutely. I was just going to quickly say that just really ties in with how you described, Susan, literacy in terms of points of access. right? And I think this model really helps us think through that and how can we remove those roadblocks for our learners. Yeah, no, that's helpful.
So today we want to speak specifically about this idea of teaching for literacy across the curriculum. And you can see there's some sub-questions here. And the first one maybe seems self-evident, especially the way you define literacy, which is accessing information and communicating ideas and in a variety of ways. But I think it's still worth always beginning with the why. So we have a literacy block. Why are we talking about literacy across the curriculum? Why is this something that we need to be thinking about in social studies or phys ed or health or science class?
Because literacy in life doesn't only happen from 9 to 10 or whatever time of the day. We use literacy in our adult lives all the time to access and communicate our understandings of the world around us. And so it's important for students to see the different applications of literacy and to be able to contextualize them in their lives outside of school and to think about how they might apply them.
I love how you even took that outside of the game of school into the reality that we're not preparing students for our curriculum, we're preparing students for their lived experience in the world, and our curriculum is a support for that. And if we're not considering the ways in which we're integrating their skill sets, they're never going to be able to, we can't expect them to put those things together if we're not helping them do that. I also think connected to why it's important is that there's such an equity built into the fact that some kids have these skills more intuitively, or have been supported to transfer them, or it's been modeled to be transferred in their home environment, or whatever the case may be, and other kids don't. And sometimes what occurs is that our science class, because there's a lack of those points of access, as you mentioned, there's those barriers that are existing that stem from a need for literacy skills. We can't have kids meet their curiosity. They may have a huge interest in science, but they don't love going to science class because of those barriers, right? Or we want all kids to be citizens that are engaged in democracy, yet social studies class has so many barriers for them. They can't access those opportunities in that class because of the barriers that exist in the way we're designing them. And yet they're going to be part of our voting public, and they spend a lot of their time in our classes without the support that they need to get there. So I think there's a real, when I think about teaching literacy across the curriculum, I really think about accessibility and equity. What about this whole idea of what does it look like in a real general sense? I know we're going to dive in really into some specifics later, but in a broader frame, I have in my grade 4 classroom, my schedule with the different subject areas. I got language arts in there, but later we're in science class. Like, what are we talking about here when we're talking about literacy across the curriculum? Are we talking about always doing language arts class, or how does this look when we're talking about designing literacy in across the curriculum?
I think the big thing, Josh, like what resonated with me with what you just said, we have no choice to take that literacy across the curriculum. There's not enough time to fit it all, right? So like when you're talking about that literacy block, trying to teach everything just within that block, there's not enough time. So as a teacher, you want to model some of those stuff as you're teaching your science, as you're teaching your math. You need to show that how to access and share their knowledge in different content areas. So because that will be the reality of the real world, right? Like it's not like that's life. Like we need to show, we have no choice to do it all throughout our content area.
I think too, it's about finding consistencies and showing connections across different areas of study and introducing students so that not everything is brand new when they move from class to class to class, but that there are some similar ways that they can access information. Information is different, and communicate about the information as well. But some of those strategies that work in one area of study can also translate into another area of study and be just as effective, and can support them in their understandings of what they're embarking upon.
Yeah, and I always kind of remember in my elementary generalist classroom that you'll refer back, like, yes, there's boundaries between the disciplines and the subject areas in your schedule, and sometimes you are taking up something within a disciplinary lens, yet because you and the students all share the vocabulary and the culture and the things you've done earlier in the day and the things you've done earlier in the year as a teacher and as students, there isn't boundaries that can't be permeated, right? That we can't draw from what we did earlier in the morning in our literacy block and reinforce that in the context of close reading we're now doing in another subject area, or the next day in the literacy block, I can't have some of the vocabulary words we were talking about in science be used at the word workstation. And so thinking about, while there's discrete sort of planning processes that we might use to think about what's going on in each of those blocks, there is connectivity that exists because we all share sort of the classroom, and core routines for me is a really important one. Things, and I think we're going to share some later today in the form of thinking strategies that can be translated across our different subject areas. Last thing I want to ask about on this slide is just, how do you begin to think about, like, do you start by thinking about access, like barriers that students access? Do you start by thinking about what next steps you feel like they need to take in order to do the activity that you're asking them to do in the other discipline? Do you begin with the literacy goals that you have in a continuum when you think about how to like design literacy into other curricular areas? Or is it kind of all those things? Like how does the teacher brain work when you think about your planning process in literacy?
Big question, Josh. You need to have that global view again because of that time. You don't have enough time, right? So you really need to take that big view, look at the outcomes that you want to teach and see the connections you can make, and giving, like, for students to be successful in the skills we're trying to teach them, they need that repetition. They need to be exposed to it more than once. So we cannot just teach it during the literacy block. If we're teaching them skills, well, let's give them the opportunity to practice it in science, in math. I'm just thinking on my son who's in grade 5, and looking at the homework that he had to do at his school is quite traditional. So they're still using textbooks for science and social studies. And some of the tests, like last week, like he had some not reading comprehension, sorry. The teacher assigned some chapters to read, and then he had some question to answer. The text was not accessible, like the text was way above his reading level, like really, really hard to understand. Thank God, well, not thank God, but I'm a mom educator, so I could, with my background, I could say, okay, buddy, let's use the same reading comprehension strategy. Like, and his teacher is using a reciprocal teaching model. So let's use those same strategies and let's try to apply it to your science or social studies text that you're trying to acquire the main message, right? So it's that transfer. I could do it because I've got that knowledge, but as teachers, we want to make sure that we're giving them multiple opportunities in different contexts to use that same strategies. Because often our strong students will learn it once and it will stick. Some of our more struggling students, it's not that they cannot learn it, is that often the piece that's missing is that repetition, giving them more time to practice those skills. Because often as teachers, like, oh, let's move on, taught it once, I've taught it and they've learned it, right? How often do we think that? And that's not because you've taught it that they've known it. It goes back to that I do, we do, you do, that gradual release. We need to make sure that in our instruction, we're giving them enough of that we do. Let's do it together. Let me show you. Let's do it together. And that do it together, we need a lot of that we do, we do, we do. During that literacy block of 1 hour a day, it's not enough. So let's make sure to maximize our schedule and do that we do, same skill, but in math and in other content area.
The other thing it makes me think of too, just really quickly, is just this idea of confidence, which kind of links back to what Josh was talking about, equity. And when I go into science, or if I'm working in a different subject area, and giving kids the skills and tools they need so that they can access the information, that it can make sense of it, they can feel confident in it. And so that's what I just really could see that working well in relation to what you were talking about as well.
Giving them skills, like I'm just thinking on math, how often, like we have teachers doing during their literacy block, like word study. So let's talk about words. Well, it's good to talk about those tier 3 words, like those content area. Like often you'll have teachers having those word wall. Okay, we're learning about science and social studies, so we'll have our word wall about Iqaluit and Inuit and igloos, like those specific content. So this would be your tier 3 vocab words. However, it's good to give specific instruction on that, but you also want to give instruction on those second tier vocab, which are those words that, like words such as describe, identify, I can think,
Analyze,
evaluate, which these are the words that you often find in different content area. I'm thinking on, again, I'll use my son as an example, that one of the tests that he got back, a lot of the questions he could quickly read what the question was about, because he looked for those words like Iqaluit, igloo, but he got the answer wrong because he did not know what evaluate means. And that word was in the question, or describe, or compare, analyze, but he was not given that background knowledge on what does it really mean, right? And I think this is the best bang for bucks. No, bang. What's the expression?
Bang for your buck.
Yes, it's to teach during your literacy. Teach, and that's an example. Teach the meaning, the subtleties of those different words that students can apply in different context area.
One of the ways we worked with our students previously was drawing on your Rockview balanced literacy framework, and we have some familiarity with these sort of concepts as a construct for our literacy block. But when I reached out to you to think about doing this, Susan, you helped me recognize that not only could these be helpful when we think about building literacy skills, but also disciplinary specific literacy skills. Some of these exact same components can be useful across the curriculum. Can you kind of fill the blanks in for us on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we talked about this before, we were sort of saying, yes, this is absolutely an important structure for that structured literacy block, but also that these components have a place in other areas of the curriculum, especially not so much focusing on the bubbles. Yes, the bubbles are important, but the continuum at the bottom, I think, is where those bubbles can become contextualized within that gradual increase of independence, gradual release of responsibility. I do, we do, you do. As an example, it's important to show students how to access texts and how to communicate effectively through the lens of the different curricular areas. So in science, teaching students about reading the different, like a science article or a page out of a book in a nonfiction text looks a lot different than a fictional piece of literature. And so teaching students about those different features that they may see on the page and the purpose for those features, and talking to them about how they might use some of those features to communicate their own ideas as well. And not just sort of throwing them to the wolves, so to speak, and saying, here's a scientific article, go read it, and then we'll come back and discuss. But going through that together and modeling for them how, as a mature reader, you would access those resources, and then as a mature literate person, how you would communicate your ideas around some of those things. And so that whole idea of modeling, and definitely not to minimize the importance of that guided work too, that sort of shared reading, shared writing, shared work alongside students, where they are also holding a pen and they're contributing to the process, just to help, sort of to what you were saying, Christy, about building confidence, giving them the time to be able to develop their own capacity to be proficient with some of these strategies or skills or things, practices that they're trying to work into their own learning journeys. But then to also be able to go on and have some independent time to apply them and feel confident in doing so.
It just reminds me when you're talking about science, just, you know, when the students are hypothesizing or they're drawing conclusions and how to draw a conclusion, how to write about it and to talk about it and inferences and things like that. You can see, again, similar scaffolding that could help the kids to develop. How do we write a good conclusion from our data? How do we interpret it? That type of thing. And that's, I see those connections now back with numeracy again, right? Where those two are overlapping.
And
I was
making
just thinking about, oh, sorry, Julie.
Oh, you go ahead, Josh.
I was just thinking we recently were using the example of the cigar box project with our students in designing for social studies. And essentially that project had us working with graphic design as a way to share,
Right.
share information about Canadian history. And so this idea of having a shared reading of a cigar box panel many times and talking about how that panel is working to communicate its message, and then shared writing using that format so that students can start to convey their understandings through imagery and design details and negative space. In some ways, seems like I could be talking about a fiction book or a level reader that we're working with, but really we're working with a primary source piece of evidence that's key to a different discipline. So it kind of came to mind for me when I'm thinking about how these concepts can overlap into different disciplines.
And I think
That's good.
what I was going to add is making, and it goes back to what Susan was saying, that we do is making that process visible for our students, which is, that's when that read aloud, that think, that write aloud, that shared experience, where you make like, reading is an internal process. So I may read and I may stumble onto a word. Our fluent readers, they will know what to do, but our struggling readers, they don't know what to do. So our job as teachers is to make that process visible. As you're trying to decode a word, show if I'm struggling with a word, what are the strategies, right? And I think making that process, I'm just going to use actually an example with Susan, in case you didn't know, English is not my first language. So writing for me in English is more of a struggle. I love drafting, writing piece with Susan, because when I write it on my own, I'm sticking to the same words, like it's very basic stuff. Doing the process with Susan, when I hear her thinking, when we draft stuff together and like she'll type something and say, oh no, let's do it this way, and then she'll erase, and like just to hear, accessing what's happening in her head is helping me so much, because as a ELL, I don't know that, like I don't know what's her thought, but giving me an insight of what's happening in her brain gives me some direction. It's like, oh, like it helps my brain having that access. So I think making our thinking visible as we're creating, either in writing or reading, accessing, making that thought process visible to our student is really important.
Well, and I think you spoke to the collaboration part too, because I mean, Josh and I are co-writing things even as academics, and all of us here as adults are strengthening our writing skills all the time, and just being able to collaborate with somebody else and see how other people write is another way to make that thinking visible. And so you can see that benefiting our students as well in the work that they're doing when they're writing about their ideas and communicating.
And Chrissy, I'm just thinking actually when I was teaching grade 6, well, any grade that I taught math, right? It would be often the I do. Okay, guys, this is how you can solve this word problem. Okay, and then I would assign them work. Now you do, right? And how often I would have students being stuck, like not knowing what to do. And often what they were missing was that we do. Let's do it together. And in some cases, and I'm thinking on math, the problem was not necessarily the operation or it was decoding what was the question about, right? And they were missing that visible process of, okay, how do you find out actually what's the task, what's the ask? They were needing that we do, making that process visible to them.
Yeah, well, that's great.
I pulled up these Alberta Ed literacy continuums just because if there's still people out there that are wondering about where literacy lives in other subject areas, I feel like you read these and you go, oh, right, this is not,
It's
this is
obvious.
not content focused. This is this, like, of course, we're developing questions in other disciplines, and we're accessing information, and we're using vocabulary. And I find that these continuums, while giving a range of, how it moves up from kindergarten through to grade 12, even just the categories that they offer get me thinking about the ways in which, and these are just a few of the many that are provided in the bigger document, but they get me seeing possibilities for where I might look to support students within other disciplines. Have you used these before in your work?
Yeah, use them in our conversations, I think, and maybe even as we were starting to take a look at thinking strategies really early on in our work together as a team, just starting to think about, okay, how does, or I guess, how do the concepts that we see in a dedicated literacy context permeate through into other areas of focus? And I think some of the broad categories that we see in the progression really helped our thinking around some of those things.
Yeah.
I'm going to
Makes sense.
I'm going to let you take over driving the computer here, because we want to introduce people watching our video to a place to get started. I think our previous conversation has hopefully given a big frame on what the need is and why. But when we start thinking about how to get started, we zoomed in on this thinking strategy placemat. And Julie, you're going to walk us through the resource.
Yeah, I think this will be really helpful for our students.
Yes, I love this. This placemat was, and Josh, I guess you'll be able to share the link on how to access this resource. This really makes sense to me. This is a resource that we created with ARPDC, where we highlighted different thinking strategies that could be used across discipline. The idea of this, as you can see, like there's 5 big components: activate, anticipate, acquire and extract, deliberate and challenge, and consolidate. We want to make sure that we're providing our students with explicit strategies that will help them doing each of those processes, which when we're thinking on our instruction, our goal, whatever I'm teaching, let's say I'm teaching about rocks and mineral. I don't want students just to learn by heart some facts. I'm hoping that number 5, they will, in my instruction, that they will be able to take action, do something with the knowledge that they have acquired, right? So to help them get into this, we want to give them some strategies that will help them getting there. So the way I like to describe them is that the first one, let's use the example of rocks and mineral. Before I give them the material, I want to activate their brains. I want to warm up, see what they know about rocks and mineral. Then I want to go into anticipate. I want to have a look about what some of the misconception that they may have. May want to also anticipate some struggle that my students may have as I'm giving them the new material. Then on number 3, once I give them the material, the text, the website, the videos that we may watch around rocks and mineral, I want to give them different tools to help them to acquire and extract the key ideas of that material. Then I want to give them some opportunity to deliberate and challenge. Okay, now I've learned about different kinds of rocks. Let's talk as a group, let's play with that knowledge, right? To solidify it, to eventually 5, get them to consolidate that knowledge and communicate, share, express what they've learned in different ways. Often we go to acquire, we give them text and we expect them right away to do that final project without giving them tools along the process. So I love this thinking strategies because from a teacher's perspective, it gives you specific strategies that you can use for those components.
And again, too, just in the context of a student's day, these strategies can be several times over through the lens of different material or different content. And so that helps them to, I think, to break down, I guess, the matrix of what or how to access the content or how to communicate about the content that they're exploring, and gives them some things that they can, or gives them some ways, I guess, to look at the concepts and things that they're trying to explore in a way that that's connected to other things that they understand, or other ways of looking at information, or talking about information, talking about their learning, just helping them make connections to things that they're already more comfortable with.
And you can see too how these thinking strategies then, as they get used regularly across all these different subjects, that then they become like this, it's in your backpack when you leave school. And now I've got a thinking strategy to use when I'm learning anything new, and take that forward as a learner into other situations. Sorry, Josh, go ahead.
It's okay. What do they look like? Show us what they look
Yeah.
like.
Just to add to Christy's point, that's the thing. If we want our students to take that in their backpack, we need to give them the purpose. Why? Because if you look, I'll just zoom out, you'll see, zoom in, sorry, many of those strategies, I know as a teacher, brainstorming, we do that all the time. Close reading, we do that all the time. But if I'm not giving the purpose and the intention of when is it beneficial to that, then it's hard for our students to apply that at different contexts, right?
Right. Yeah.
Because exactly, like I'm thinking on when I did my master degree, I use many of those strategies. So these are skills that we want our students to use, not just when they do their master, but like in different areas. But if we don't give them the purpose of how is this going to help you? So I think the key point of this, and it's interesting, when we created that resource, most of the teachers like, why do we need to talk about brainstorming? Everyone, like, think aloud, everyone does that, but they don't do it with the intention, and they don't make that intention explicit to this. I'm thinking on my students, or my kid actually, again, talking about him. I was looking at his social studies book and at his notes, and it was interesting because, oh, mom, the homework is I need to highlight stuff, right? That's what I would call here acquire and extract close reading. When I looked at his note, he had highlighting pretty much the whole
Everywhere.
thing, right? And I was like, and then as we talk, what I realized is that he did not understand the purpose of this, right? It was not clear. So for him, it was just a to-do. It was just a task that, as a student, now I know that my child doesn't know how this can benefit him in math, science, in other content area, right? So it goes back to having that explicit, it needs that purpose needs to be quite explicit. Okay, so let's talk about each strategies. I love this website because it's extremely user-friendly. So as you can see here on the top, you've got each component. So you've got Activate, and on the drop-down menus, you've got those 10 strategies for Activate, Anticipate, Acquire, and Extract. As well, if I click here on Activate, each strategy has the same layout. So you'll have a one-page PDF that will explain the strategy, how to use it, why exactly using the strategy, how to modify, and different ways to assess it. Under some of the strategies, we will give you specific example and templates. So as teachers, like, make sure to look through. Susan, our lovely Susan, did a fantastic job, because sometimes as teacher, it's good to read, but sometimes we want to see. So under some of the strategies, you'll be able to see a video. So Susan went to film some of our teachers using these strategies. So you'll be able to see what it looks like in a classroom. So that was a fantastic.
And it was really, just as an aside, as part of the the development of those resources, it was really helpful for me to contextualize how these strategies might work within the classroom, because we did ask teachers about their use of them, but we also were able to ask the students and to hear from them how these strategies were used, whether or not they found them helpful. I never wanted to assume that they did, but several of them did speak to how they helped them with their understanding of their curriculum.
So let's have a look at one. It's called the anticipation guides. That's one that's really, I do love this one. This is one example of Susan's video here. You've got that PDF. So anticipation guide, I love this one. Susan, do you want to talk about this one maybe?
Sure. I think this is a great tool. I shouldn't say it's just about the tool. It's about the strategy of anticipation. I was caught on that once, and it's important to not just focus on the tool itself, but the philosophy behind the tool, and that idea of warming up the brain, like Julie was saying earlier, and getting ready to hopefully make connections to some of what's in your background knowledge, what you've already been able to experience and connect with. And so I love this. I think there are several formats for this, and there are a couple here. One of the most interesting ones I've ever seen was one with actually no words, but just math equations. And the prompt, the initial prompt at the top of the page was, what is this equation saying? So is it saying that the value is increasing? Is it saying that the value is being divided? And so just for that teacher, I think she was starting a unit on multiplication and division with her grade 5 students, and to have a look at some of the data that she was able to get back about what the students understood about how the variables in the equations were being changed or altered depending on where they sat in those equations was really, really powerful. I know we've used these too in our own professional sessions with teachers. Really, they work really well too. So many different contexts for a strategy and tool like this that yeah, it's just a great way to have students really think about whatever the statement is or whatever the prompt is that's given, and make connections to what they know about it. And the results can be shared just with the teacher, or you can have them get together and do some discussion around it afterwards too, and have, you know, the debates that ensue when they have opportunities to do that are pretty cool to watch.
That's what I was going to say, Susan. I did that with a group of teachers last year, and it was interesting because the idea is that you give some statements. So we had a text. You give some statement, and then before reading the text, the teacher had to write true or false. And to me, honestly, when we designed that task, it's like, oh, it's so obvious which statements are true or false. Like, to me, it was a no-brainer. Then after you get them to read the text, then you get them to review. Was it really true or was it false? And then the power, exactly to what Susan said, is to let the students talk together. I was so surprised because in my mind, the statement that I knew was like, so obvious it's true or false. The discussion that it generated, because teachers were looking, like, that's not a good example, but fables or nonfictions. Is it always? Not always. Like, they were discussing every single words and different layers on how you could read that statement, and it brought that discussion to much of a deeper level than I expected. And that's when the mess, like learning is happening when it's messy, and that's exactly what it got teachers to think of, and that was fantastic. Okay, another one that I want to share that's one of my favorite is interpreting pictures and visualizing. This is a strategy, and I'll show you a concrete example. So this is when you would show pictures, and I'll show you a concrete example. The example I'm going to show you is in French, but I think even if you don't speak the language, you'll be able to understand the idea. This was before doing a read aloud of the book Secret Path. If you're not familiar with this book, it's a fantastic book. And if you go and learn Alberta, there's all kinds of free lessons and stuff that you can do with this book that has indigenous content. So before we did that read aloud, what I've done is just take some pictures from the book. And again, trying to warm up the brain of the students, asking them, so when you're looking at these pictures, what are the words that come to you? What are the emotion? What's the ambiance? And then what do you think the message is that we want to show in these pictures? Again, like we did that using Jamboard, where the students could put their ideas and then together after we discuss. So that was a very powerful activity that we did. So that would be for Activate. And Spate, I like I'll share with you one, it's called the Freyer model. Sure you've seen it used before. There's different example that you can use it in math or in social studies. One way that we have done it, I will show you again using Jamboard, was taking a word such as democracy. Then as a group, they had to use Post-it, finding synonyms of this word, trying to do a definition, defining it in their own word, putting this word in a sentence. And I like this section here where they had to, and for the purpose of this activity, I changed the different categories, but the last one was trying to illustrate, what does it mean, democracy? And giving the opportunity for students to either draw it. And in this case, we actually used the website non-project where students could use icons that would represent that meaning. So that was another way to share. But again, the power of this is not just to do it individually, is then after talk as a group, discuss this. So
another component that commonly shows up in Freyer models, I know Julie's is a little bit different than some of the other templates that you'll see on that website, but to task students to provide non-examples, it just causes them to have to think about whatever the sort of central term or vocabulary word that they're looking to expand on is having them think about that and in sort of an unexpected way. I know my grade 4s used to have so much fun with the non-examples. I wish I could think of an example of their non-examples right now, but that was their favorite part of doing the Freyer models, was what it isn't.
Another one for Anticipate, and that is the vocab self-awareness. I love this because as a teacher, it gives you an idea of, it guides you on what you need to teach. So the idea of this is that before you teach your unit, let's say rocks and mineral, or if we're looking at this, you will take the key vocab that you know that your students will encounter, and then you ask them to put a check or a minus sign if whether they know the words. Actually, in this case, we've got 3 categories. Do they know the words? Are they able to give an example and a definition? So then as a teacher, that's really good because you can see if no students are able to define it or to give example, well, you need to work on all those words. You can have a look at the definition or the example. Can they do both? Ideally, that's what we're looking for. Do they have the right definition? Do they have misconception about some of those words? So you may need to go back and reteach those. And this is something you can do at the beginning of a unit, but you could actually do it at the end to see if that knowledge has been mastered. So this is really an interesting, and thinking again, just like when we're talking about the cross discipline, yes, here's a math example, right? Like you can do that in all disciplines. So this is one of my favorite strategy. Another one that I love is word sort. And I'm going to show you, there's different ways to do it. I'm going to show you, so you have different word, like again, word sort, but here, there's an example here in math. There's different ways that you can use word sort. One example that I have done, here, I'll show you the Jamboard, was giving, it was actually not words, it was concept, where I had given, now you're seeing the final results, but I had different pictures and without giving, so it was called an open sort, where I didn't give any categories, but the task was for the students to form categories, and then they had to add adjectives and tell me why they created those categories. So again, that discussion, right? So in this case, it was about heroes and like different character traits from different people. But you could do that in science. Going on actually Learn Alberta has, if you go to your subject area and the grade level, if you search, you can click on different media. And if you look just for image, it will generate all the image that in social studies, rock and minerals you may want. So you can just go copy those images, put them in a Jamboard like this, and then asking students to create different categories. So this is a good way to teach concept for these ones. Any other strategies, Susan? That's all I have on my little post-it. Is there anything else we want to highlight?
Not anything specific, just there are so many, like, I think it's important to not feel with the breadth of strategies available here under each sort of phase of the learning process, to not feel like students need to have access to all of these or be introduced to all of them, and to sort of just pick a couple core ones that will make sense for your learners and your content that you wish for them to explore and communicate about.
And again, to give them the opportunity, we're seeing this in social studies, let's use that same tool for science, in math, in all content areas, so they're familiar with this. And again, giving them the purpose. Why are we using this strategy?
Yeah, I love how that's going to start to break down whether I think I'm good at a subject area or not. You know, like you often have kids see themselves as good in science or not good in math. And if rather I start to see that the strategies that I use can help me, I can use that strategy in science, which is one I think I'm good at, and then I can draw that across and employ it in social studies. That starts to break down those barriers of thinking of myself as one or the other, but rather seeing this all as a journey towards thinking in different ways and how I can apply my strengths and identify my needs across, you know, my journey, which is a whole different vision of what we're thinking about with education and changing the locus of responsibility, really, of who's, again, I keep thinking of Shelley Moore's pilot video about who's making the adjustments to the cockpit. And it's like, you want to give these strategies you've introduced us to today, I really realize how that can support students to begin to identify what they need in a cockpit, wherever, you know, whatever they're flying in, and how that can then help them be more metacognitive with their processes of thinking, right, and communicating, which, as you suggested, is going to be hopefully their lifelong journey.
And I think, Josh, not the danger, but I would not want teachers to use the different template of the strategies like as a worksheet, right? And I wouldn't, like, it's not just one activity. There's a purpose behind it, exactly to your point, that they can use in different contexts. So giving them, and it goes back to what Christy, you were saying at the beginning, these are tools that we're adding in the toolbox that you can navigate throughout different literacies that you're going to encounter in life, right?
The other thing too that just makes me think of as we're talking about this is how teaching is about learning, right? It's about generating those opportunities for kids to make those connections to, and like we talked about the definition at the very beginning about making meaning of the world around us. And students are not going to make meaning by just us disseminating facts to them. They need to know, they need these thinking strategies. So I think there's some really helpful just ways for us to look at that and to move beyond just thinking that we just have to get through the curriculum and give the kids all the facts and then we've checked off those things on our list. That's not our goal. Our goal is for them to learn. So I think that was helpful today, just seeing those examples of how we could do that, what that could look like.
Yeah, learn, apply, and then transfer into their lives, right?
Exactly.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate our partnership with you and learning alongside of you. We value so much how you make your learning visible in your roles in Rocky View. I know you do that in part to serve the teachers that you're working with, but it's so valuable for our pre-service teachers. And we hope that we send them off to you with a few of these things in their toolbox so that you can continue moving forward your mission in your system and really in our world in general. So thank you for being you. Thank you for giving your time for us today. really value it.
Yes, thank you so much for coming and joining us.
Our pleasure. Thank you.